I always thought I knew what life was. My life. It seemed like a well-oiled machine, with familiar rhythms, with unchanging actions. I worked at a startup creating apps. It was interesting work, but not the kind that demands you to change something about yourself or the world. It was more of a quiet, steady flow. Yes, sometimes there were moments of inspiration when it felt like something new was about to be revealed. But those moments were rare, and most of the time, work remained just another part of the daily routine. My life might have seemed boring to someone, but I liked it. In the evenings, I met with Rebecca, a friend, for yoga. We talked about how important it is to find balance between the body and the mind, how stress and the pressures of daily life can pull us away from ourselves. Sometimes we sat in a cafe, chatting with the barista about new coffee recipes, about trivial things that made me feel that everything was stable and calm. That's how things went. That's how everything was supposed to be. And then one day, on my way home, I met him. It happened so accidentally that, had I not known myself so well, I might have thought it was fate. But I didn't believe in such things. I just met him, as you meet someone on the street. His eyes, his smile, his manner. It all seemed to transcend what I had considered my world. I didn't think anything would change, but something did. At that moment, I didn't even realize how fragile the life I liked so much was. We met, and everything that had seemed stable began to crumble. But I didn't know that ahead of me were still many more encounters, many more words that would turn everything upside down. James and I moved to this neighborhood almost 2 years ago, and at that time, it seemed perfect. A quiet, peaceful, almost rural corner where everything was familiar. The houses were mostly old, with green yards and neat fences. People lived here who seemed like a part of the place, like its foundation. Newcomers quickly became one of their own, and even though I wasn't particularly sociable, I had gotten used to this environment. Everything was stable. Everything was in its place. Then, one day, on an ordinary weekday, Alex appeared on the street. He was clearly not from this world. It was obvious from the start that he didn't belong to this secluded, measured life. He was too bright, too loud for this neighborhood. A street artist, not afraid of bold colors and daring ideas. He didn't follow the rules, didn't hide, but rather drew attention. He was like a character from an old movie, bursting into a scene and changing the entire script. It was as though some fragment of vibrant life had ended up in the wrong place, and it was impossible to ignore. We met by chance when I was walking my dog in the park. Alex was standing by one of the walls, painting graffiti. I didn't even know it was graffiti. To me, it was just a drawing on a wall, but something in the way he worked drew me in. His gaze, his confidence. He noticed me, and despite my unease about looking like a complete amateur in this art, we started a conversation. Alex talked about his work, about graffiti, about how he travels the world and paints wherever he wants, without caring what others think. It felt so natural, so free, that I, without even knowing why, found myself wanting to talk to him more and more. From that day on, I began to run into him in the most unexpected places. It was as though he was blending into the city, becoming a part of it. His name, his face started to appear somewhere against the backdrop of familiar streets, and I suddenly realized that this encounter was not a coincidence. It was the beginning of something, and even though I couldn't understand what exactly at that moment, I felt how it was changing me. The next meeting with Alex happened in a completely unexpected place, a bar where I had come with colleagues after work. We didn't go there often, but that day I decided to go out, to take a break from everything. And there I was, standing at the bar, chatting about small things with a friend, when I felt someone looking at me. I turned around, and there he was, Alex. He was sitting at a table in the center, as always, relaxed, with a smile that seemed familiar, yet at the same time still somewhat mysterious. He noticed me, nodded, and it was immediately clear that this wasn't just a random encounter. I wasn't planning on meeting anyone that evening. In fact, I wasn't used to striking up conversations with people in places like that. But something about his presence made me feel that this was the moment. I walked over to him, sat down opposite, and the conversation flowed on its own. Alex was as vibrant and passionate as the first time, and his eyes, full of passion and openness, were as mesmerizing as ever. He began talking about his travels, about the cities he had visited, the exhibitions he had been to, the people he had met. But the most important thing he said was about freedom, about how important it is not to live by other people's rules, but to find your own path. I didn't even notice how the conversation shifted from art and travel to something much more personal. We talked about life, about how sometimes you lose yourself in the routine, how the pursuit of stability can turn into a trap. Alex spoke so easily, so confidently, that I began to forget about my present, to forget that I was married. His words became little revelations for me, so simple, yet so true. I felt how he made me look at the world differently, how he pushed me to seek answers to questions I hadn't even considered before. His gaze was like an open book, unafraid to tell its story. And at that moment, I realized that for me, this wasn't just a conversation. It was something that opened up an entirely new world inside me. Then, by accident, my hand brushed against his, barely perceptible but somehow genuine. It was sincere, without any ulterior motive, and yet in that very moment I felt everything around me starting to shift. I couldn't explain what exactly was happening, but something inside me had turned over. Alex, as before, was simply himself, open, sincere, not hiding from life. And in that moment I realized that I could no longer return to the world I had before him. A few days passed, and his messages started appearing on my phone. The first ones were about his new project. Alex suggested that I help organize a party for local artists and musicians. It didn't seem like anything unusual, but I was surprised by how easily and without any formalities he included me in this process. I didn't know what to expect, but I agreed. Perhaps this was my first step toward change, even though I wasn't yet aware of it. I invited him to dinner at the restaurant that James and I frequented, hoping it would help keep everything within the bounds of my usual routine. James was busy with work, and I knew it would just be one evening, one meeting, after which I would return to my normal, predictable world. But when Alex arrived, everything changed. He was completely different from how I had imagined him. He was straightforward, open, and full of energy. He didn't try to appear more serious than he was. There was no theatricality or pretense. He was just himself, and that feeling was like a breath of fresh air in a closed room. We didn't just talk about his project, not only about work and life. We talked about what truly mattered, about the things that really concerned us, about how often we let ourselves be cornered by our own desires and expectations, which, as it turned out, weren't even ours. Alex spoke with such sincerity that I could feel all the familiar boundaries of my world dissolving. With him, there was no game, no caution. He was honest, and that's what surprised me. I saw that his life wasn't as simple as mine, but that was exactly what attracted me. He wasn't perfect, but that was part of his beauty. He wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. His eyes, his gaze, it was honesty, the kind I hadn't encountered in a long time. At one point, I forgot about James, forgetting that I was even married. That evening, on my way home, I tried to pinpoint the moment when everything changed. It felt like I could no longer go back to what had been before. Alex didn't become someone who simply brought me a fleeting joy or a temporary intrigue. He became part of something greater, something I couldn't even name. And his openness, his reality, started knocking me off my feet. A few days later, he wrote again, saying he couldn't wait to see me at the party. In every message, there was something more than just curiosity. I could see how he was seeking a response from me, and I couldn't help but reply. But inside me, a feeling was growing that I was standing on the edge of something that could change my entire life. It was an evening I will never forget. We met at an exhibition in one of the art galleries in the city center. I knew Alex would be there, but I didn't expect the encounter to be so intense. He was at the heart of everything, the conversations, the ideas, the gaze that left no chance of staying on the sidelines. Everything he said seemed like undeniable truth, and the energy he radiated completely captivated me. I tried to stay in the shadows, not drawing attention. James was at home and I wasn't looking to create unnecessary questions, but as soon as our eyes met in the crowd, everything changed. It was a moment I felt in every nerve, in every cell. I could have turned away, kept my distance, but something in his gaze wouldn't let me. We were drawn together like magnets, and everything that had once seemed distant and impossible now felt so clear that I could barely hold myself back. Alex approached me with a light, almost imperceptible confidence. He didn't say anything, just ran his hand along my back, a gesture that was both familiar and foreign. It felt as though he had touched my very heart, that place I had been trying to hide, trying not to acknowledge. And at that moment, everything I had been trying to control slipped away. I felt a whole new world opening up, beyond the familiar. I suddenly realized that I couldn't stay in this world anymore. "Are you tired of what's going on?" His voice was quiet, but sure. "Do you want to change the scenery for a bit?" He wasn't asking, he knew I wouldn't be able to stay. I couldn't answer immediately because even in that silence, in that moment, I had already made my decision. My heart was beating wildly, and strangely my whole life suddenly felt alien to me. I felt an invisible but incredibly strong thread suddenly stretch between us. My hand slid into his, and I knew I couldn't go back. I could no longer be the person I was before. I couldn't return to the quiet life I had led. Everything that had come before this moment now seemed insignificant. I didn't try to analyze, I didn't look for excuses. It was all so obvious, so real. And although I understood that this step would change me, I couldn't stop. It was as if my path had already been chosen, and I was simply walking down it, not understanding what exactly awaited me there. And then I realized that I could no longer live in two worlds. My choice had been made. The next day, Alex invited me to take a walk in the park. It was early morning, and the air hadn't yet filled with the heat of the day. Around us was silence, only occasionally interrupted by the sounds of footsteps or birds. We walked along the path, between tall trees that seemed to wrap around us with their branches, creating a kind of protective shell from the outside world. Everything around us was calm and secluded, and in that moment, I felt that I could be myself. For a moment, all the anxiety and tension I had felt in recent days disappeared. Alex was silent. He just walked beside me, and that silence was so complete that I didn't feel the need to speak. Sometimes he would glance at me, his eyes carefully studying every movement, every gesture. And then, when we stopped at an old oak tree, he said something that, to me, seemed to open up something very important in my life. "When I first saw you," he said, "I thought you were just like everyone else. You were a part of this world, nothing special, just like the rest. But then I realized that you're probably searching for something more, something beyond the ordinary." I stopped, not knowing what to say. His words sounded like a revelation. I had always thought I knew who I was, that I was happy enough with my life. But suddenly, it became clear to me that I had always been searching for something more, that I had long since gotten lost in this routine, in these obligations, and hadn't realized how long I had been forgetting my true desires. "Have you ever felt like your life isn't really yours?" he continued, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "That you're living by someone else's rules but not your own?" He spoke, and I understood that he knew exactly what he was talking about. It was like a mirror that suddenly showed me my whole life, the one I had been living and the one I could have had. I was shaken, not knowing what to do with this feeling. I felt as though everything I had once considered stable was starting to crumble. I didn't even know how to respond to his words because they were too accurate. Alex was talking about things I had never dared to think aloud, about freedom, about how easy it is to get lost in the everyday, in what others impose on you, and how difficult, even frightening, it can be to choose your own path. Maybe sometimes, in order to find yourself, you need to step beyond what you know, he asked, as if pushing me to the thought that I could change everything. And at that moment, I felt my world changing. I couldn't answer immediately because I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew one thing. Something inside me had awakened, and this conversation had become the key that opened the door to a completely new world. When we started walking again, I felt the weight of the passing day disappear. In its place came clarity. I couldn't say for certain what awaited me ahead, but I no longer wanted to return to the old. James noticed the changes, even though I tried to hide them. He had always been attentive to me, and despite my efforts to maintain the appearance of my usual life, he saw that something was wrong. I remember coming home late one evening, and as I opened the door, I saw him sitting on the couch with that same expression on his face, calm, but with some shadow of concern in his eyes. I immediately realized that he wasn't just waiting for me, he knew. He stood up, took a step toward me, and before I could say anything, he asked a direct question that I couldn't look away from. "You're in love with him, aren't you?" he said. And his voice was quiet, almost emotionless, as though he had already accepted this thought. I was literally struck cold. I stood in the doorway, not knowing what to answer. The question was simple, but each word seemed to slice through me, drawing out all the insecurity and confusion I had been trying to hide. I knew I couldn't lie. Yes, in his voice there was that certainty, that I could no longer hide it. I loved James, but something in his words and his tone showed me that he had already seen that I couldn't stay in this space. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stepped aside, trying to find the words. But they wouldn't come. My heart was beating so loudly that it felt like it would burst out of my chest. There was so much pain in his question that I felt guilty, though I couldn't say exactly why. "I don't know what to do, James," I finally said, my voice barely audible. "I can't just ignore this. I can't stay here when I feel like everything I've built has suddenly crumbled. I faltered, trying to gather my thoughts, which were tangled in my head. James looked at me, and his eyes, full of sadness and despair, left no room for excuses. He probably already knew the answer, but in his gaze there was a kind of helplessness, as if he had lost me before I had even left for good. We didn't talk about what would happen next, but I felt how his gaze was pulling me away from everything I had known. It felt heavy, as if I were tearing away part of my soul, part of my past. But I knew that in that moment, when he asked, I had already made my choice. I could no longer go back. At some point, almost instinctively, we found ourselves together. My hand reached for his, and suddenly, it was as though everything I had wanted became impossible, and everything I had feared became clear. We kissed. And it happened. After I left home, the world around me became bright, yet at the same time, frightening. My whole life, familiar and understandable, was left behind, and I found myself on some kind of edge where there was no turning back. I returned to Alex, but even in his apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of confusion. Everything I had once considered right, everything that had been familiar, now seemed foreign. I tried to fit into this new reality, but something kept holding me back from fully immersing myself in it. Alex was there, taking care of me, trying to be the person I was looking for, but still, I couldn't forget what I had left behind. He tried to convince me that everything would be fine, that I had made the right choice. But the more time I spent with him, the more doubts overwhelmed me. In his apartment, surrounded by his things, I felt that everything wasn't as I had imagined it. There were no idyllic pictures that I had painted in my mind, no freedom or certainty that I had dreamed of. It was a life full of difficulties, questions, and unclear prospects. We weren't perfect for each other, and everything seemed more complicated than I had envisioned. In the evenings, we often sat together talking about life, about what we wanted from it. Alex didn't hide that it wasn't easy for him, that everything we were building was a process that required effort and courage. He tried to be what I needed, but I already felt that this path wouldn't be easy. My heart increasingly returned to James, to what I had left behind. Each day, it became harder to convince myself that I had made the right choice. One day, sitting in his apartment, I realized that I could no longer play this game. I couldn't let go of my past, but I couldn't return to it either. Alex was there, but even with him, I felt lost, as if I couldn't find the woman who could be happy. In that moment, I understood that all this passion, all this brightness I had been searching for, couldn't be the only answer. I couldn't just forget my past. I couldn't ignore the life I had left. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't go back to it. Life with Alex wasn't perfect, it wasn't romantic like I had thought, but it was real. It held not only freedom but also challenge and responsibility. I couldn't get back what I had before, but I couldn't stay in this new world without consequences. This was the moment I realized that it didn't matter which path I chose. I had already made the choice that had changed me forever. But the path ahead was mine, and now I had to learn to live with that choice.